LiberalViewer presents.
So, welcome to the May 22nd edition of LiberalViewer Monday Media Mixup. Thanks for joining me. I'll be using the dozen best, most newsworthy clips I picked out from the Sunday morning news analysis shows from the big five corporate outlets of ABC, NBC, CBS, CNN, and Fox News, the so-called corporate media here in the United States, for what should be a really informative corporate media here in the United States. I forgot to do my air quotes. For what should be a really informative, educational, fair use media criticism and political commentary for you all today. As you can see from the video title, my main topic is, will U.S. partisan politics crash the world economy, which is about the negotiations that are ongoing to avoid the U.S. defaulting on its debt, some possibly around June 1st or in the first couple weeks of June, if it's never happened before, but so many things that have never happened before happened in the last 4 years, and especially the Republicans have gotten a lot more unreasonable, not that they were all that reasonable to begin with, on these debt ceiling negotiations, and I'll talk about that a lot more. It's a self-made crisis that, the U.S. political system created this crisis for itself, just because this ridiculous raising of the debt ceiling. It's kind of like the negotiating that goes on before the government's going to shut down. We make these crises, and it's kind of ridiculous, and it's part of our partisan politics. And anyway, I'll talk about that more after I show you my political comedy. My political comedy for this week is a rare retraction for getting a story wrong from Fox News's Laura Ingraham, her show The Ingraham Angle. But the retraction didn't really fit the original story that I saw repeated over and over again on the straight news programs, the not so straight news programs, the political pundit programs like Laura Ingraham's. And the retraction was so brief and took so little responsibility for what they did. First, I'm going to show the retraction, then I'll show how the story ran a couple days before on the Ingraham Angle. But here's the ridiculous retraction I'll talk about with you a little more after we watch it together over here.
Mulvaney. All right, before we go, a little update on a story we brought you this week about homeless vets being displaced from hotels so that illegals could move in. Turns out the group behind the claim made it up. We have no clue as to why anyone would do such a thing, but we'll bring you any updates should they come. But up next, the 2024 GO primary is...
They have no clue why anyone would make up a scary story about immigrants, even though, all day, every day on Fox News, you see this Biden's border crisis with all sorts of stories, some of which turn out to be true, some of which turn out not to be true, about how immigrants are being scary and threatening people and, displacing real Americans and all. And if you want to see what that story was retracting, it was a New York Post story, which, of course, remember, the New York Post is owned by the same Rupert Murdoch Corporation, News Corp, that owns Fox News. And Laura Ingraham not only reported the story, not mentioning the New York Post is also owned by the same corporation as Fox News, but then said a Fox News reporter had confirmed the story. Here's the story that ran a couple days earlier on the Ingraham Angle.
Nothing's going to be done. And that's not all. In Orange County, New York, homeless veterans were tossed out of their temporary housing. So illegals, they have to have a place to stay.
You had New York City come in and said, look, I will take every room for the next, up until January 1st. So anybody that's in there, they canceled. And these veterans, they were given the boot. Did they want to occupy as many rooms as they could? Yeah. And in the meantime, did they disrupt a lot of people's lives? Yes.
Joining me now, David Riley, New York State commander of the American Legion. David, this is a hellscape story, okay? Fox's Nate Foy now has confirmed that those displaced vets are now safely in a different hotel, and a judge is now barring Adams from trying to send more illegals there. But we know what the intention was. Second-class citizens are veterans. Primary, most celebrated citizens who get all the benefits, non-citizens, fraudulent asylees into the United States. Your reaction to all of this?
My reaction to all this is that you needed to do a much better retraction than the 24 seconds I showed that where Laura Ingraham said.
Mulvaney. All right, before we go, a little update on a story we brought you this week about homeless vets being displaced from hotels so that illegals could move in. Turns out the group behind the claim made it up. We have no clue as to why anyone would do such a thing, but we'll bring you any updates should they come. But up next...
Oh, and of course, by the way, the use of the word illegals, it's not only like a dehumanizing term that shouldn't be used as applied to anyone, including undocumented immigrants, but in this case, we're talking about people who are seeking asylum. They even called them bogus, like they've already adjudicated that they don't deserve asylum in that earlier clip from earlier in the week where they claimed they were displacing these homeless veterans. But these are legal immigrants. It's legal to request asylum and then to be released until your court date, which is these people who are going to New York. I watch it, like I said, all day, every day, at least once an hour. There's some story about Biden's border crisis that's scaring the Fox News viewer about immigrants coming to take their jobs or, displace their homeless veterans or, be scary and criminal and it's just like Trump coming down the escalator in, June 2015, where he, talked about, they're not sending the rapists and murderers and not sending us their best. And anyway, it's Fox News is where that whole mindset lives. And it's ridiculous because immigration is actually good for our economy. It actually solves a lot of our problems in terms of our aging workforce and our need to have more active workers versus retirees, and we have a labor shortage. We have like very low unemployment and more jobs available than workers for a lot of job openings, and so the whole thing is just ridiculous. And talk about partisan scare talking points. I just wanted to start the show with that, and now go over to the news summaries from longest to shortest. And the longest one this week is actually the Fox News Sunday one, where they report on Biden's press conference that happened like 3:30 in the morning, my time, California, on Sunday, just a few hours before the shows. All the shows covered that except for Meet the Press. So I'll criticize Meet the Press when I get to that news summary in a couple news summaries. But Fox News, they, of course, did not like the way that Biden confronted Republicans. You'll see in the CNN State of the Union news summary, they talk about him hardening his position. I think it's Terry Moran in the ABC This Week with George Stephanopoulos news summary talks about Biden hardening his position. But for Fox News, he's slamming Republicans. And they also talk about the silly balloon comment that he made, which actually references a video I made a couple months back that I'll talk about after we watch the Fox News Sunday news summary together over here.
Hello from Fox News in Washington. Breaking this morning, the president slamming Republicans over stalled talks on the debt limit. The comments coming in a rare press conference. The president says Republicans have to accept that there is no bipartisan deal if they stick only to what he deems their partisan terms. But Speaker McCarthy says the president is letting left-wing Democrats call all of the shots. So now the president's on his way home and is expected to talk directly with House Speaker Kevin McCarthy while on the flight. But with no breakthroughs this weekend, the talks are down to the wire. The president was asked whether he'd consider going around Congress by invoking the 14th Amendment to avoid the U.S. defaulting on its bills. I'll tell you what he said. Congress has just about 10 days left to get some kind of deal together. In a moment, we'll sit down with Texas Senator Ted Cruz for his reaction to the president's hardline comments this morning. But first, let's turn to our own Peter Doocy live in Hiroshima, Japan. All right, Peter, let's start here. Does the president actually think he's got authority to raise the debt limit on his own, go around Congress, use the 14th Amendment?
Yes, Shannon, we heard for the first time this evening here in Hiroshima, he thinks he does. Would you be blameless in a default situation?
On the merits, based on what I've offered, I would be blameless. On the politics of it, no one will be blameless. And by the way, that's one of the things that some are contemplating. I actually had, well, I got to be careful here. I think there are some MAGA Republicans in the House who know the damage that it would do to the economy. And because I am president and president's responsible for everything, Biden would take the blame, and that's the one way to make sure Biden's not reelected.
So, that soundbite speaks to President Biden's description of Republican ideas during these debt talks as extreme and unacceptable, which means it's unclear who he thinks should get the credit or the who should get credit for a deal or a default. We also do have his explanation about why he thinks that he could invoke the 14th Amendment and go around Congress right here.
I'm looking at the 14th Amendment as to whether or not we have the authority. I think we have the authority. The question is, could it be done and invoked in time that it would not be appealed and as a consequence past the date in question and still default on the debt?
The G7 here in Japan put their heads together to try to figure out how to put Ukraine on a path towards F-16 capabilities, and they tried to figure out how to work with China without letting China take advantage of the world's economies. He says that he expects relations with Xi to thaw soon, and that comes after what he described as an incident earlier this year with a, quote, silly balloon that carried 2 freight cars of spy equipment. He calls it silly now, but remember, he did order a fighter jet to shoot it down this winter. Shannon.
Yeah, we've got more questions after that press conference, but we're glad you got yours in. Peter Doocy reporting from Hiroshima. Safe travels home, Peter. Thank you. All right, joining us now, Texas Republican Senator Ted Cruz. Senator, welcome back.
And I will have a very brief clip, my shortest newsmaker clip of Ted Cruz. I know a lot of people find watching Ted Cruz excruciating. It's the final clip, clip 12. It's less than 2 minutes long. If you can't watch it, you can sign off early, I guess. But I kind of enjoyed that part where Peter Doocy was criticizing President Biden for calling the Chinese spy balloon silly, because I actually made a whole video about that in which I pointed out that Fox News was trying to make the Chinese spy balloon more scary by not saying the word balloon, because balloons are kind of silly. And I just put a link to the video I made a couple months ago on that topic. And I also pretty much pre-criticized that clip, but you saw how like all of Biden's criticisms of Republicans were highlighted as, slamming Republicans and making accusations against them, that maybe there are some Republicans who want to crash the economy so that Biden can't get reelected. And anyway, I'm going to contrast that to, I think, a more journalistic news summary that also talks about the Biden press conference, also talks about the debt ceiling drama, and even mentions the F-16s that Biden has now promised to give to Ukraine at some point, starting to train Ukrainian pilots. And I'll talk about all of that a little more after we watch that clip together over here.
Good morning and welcome to This Week. President Biden has just wrapped a press conference capping his trip to Japan for the G7 summit. After 4 days of meetings with world leaders on global challenges, the president turned his focus back to the looming debt crisis and tense negotiations in Washington that now seem further apart than ever. Talks with Republican leaders broke down over the weekend, just 11 days until the Treasury runs out of money to pay its bills. As he prepares to talk directly to House Speaker Kevin McCarthy this morning, Biden made clear that if Democrats are willing to cut spending, Republicans should also be prepared to compromise.
It's time for Republicans to accept that there is no bipartisan deal to be made solely on their partisan terms. America has never defaulted on our debt, and it never will.
Senior national correspondent Terry Moran was at the press conference and joins us now from Japan. And Terry, that was quite a press conference.
It sure was, Martha. President Biden called this summit, quote, extremely significant and important, but there's no question that his time here was constantly shadowed by the debt limit crisis back home. And as those negotiations in Washington have hit the wall, the president really upped the ante here today in Japan. He declared at his press conference that since he's compromised by agreeing to cut and cap some spending, now it is the Republicans' turn to move. And it was definitely just a harder tone, much harder, from President Biden on this. He said Republicans need to move from their, quote, extreme positions, and that what they've proposed is simply, frankly, unacceptable. He also said he does believe he has the authority under the 14th Amendment to follow that amendment's command that, quote, the national debt shall not be questioned and borrow money without congressional approval. But he said he thought the country could still go into default while the issue was appealed all the way up to the Supreme Court, where he'd likely lose. And he said, ominously almost, that he couldn't guarantee that the country would default if the other side does something outrageous. All in all, it was quite a press conference, and one that will probably rattle the markets a bit.
Probably will, Terry. And Terry, the president also endorsing that plan for Ukraine to eventually get F-16 fighter jets. That's really a sharp reversal from just a few months ago.
It really is, Martha. 4 months the president said that he didn't believe and his military didn't believe that the Ukrainians needed the F-16s. But several European allies came out publicly supporting the idea. Zelensky has called for it, and so the president has relented, although there are strings attached here. What he agreed to is to allow Ukrainian pilots to be trained how to fly the F-16 at some point. He said that training could take months, and in the end, the National Security Advisor, Jake Sullivan, said the United States still has final approval on when those jets might be delivered and how many Ukraine would get. Martha?
Thanks so much, Terry Moran in Japan. And joining us now is Congressman Jody Arrington of Texas.
And I will have a clip of Jody Arrington of Texas, who is the chair of the House Budget Committee, talking about these debt ceiling negotiations. You saw they mentioned the F-16s there. The F-16s were even mentioned on Fox News Sunday at some point. All of the Big Five corporate outlet Sunday morning news analysis shows mentioned the Biden press conference and this offer of F-16s, and it looks like what the G7 members, along with some associate nations that also attended this conference in Hiroshima, Japan, have decided is that they're going to give strong support to the Ukraine for this counteroffensive that's probably going to come up in the next few weeks. And if Ukraine can make some real territorial gains with this counteroffensive, that'll put them in a really good position to negotiate a peace maybe sometime this year. Seems like that's what the plan is, based on clips I'm not showing and having watched the Biden press conference in full from Hiroshima that was around 3:30 a.m. Pacific time. It went from like 2:57 a.m. to like 3:40 a.m. A rare Biden press conference. He was up there by himself answering questions, which all the Republicans say he doesn't have the cognitive ability to do, but he actually did it, and I watched it. And that seems like there's a good strategy, a good plan, a good alliance and coalition that protects the sovereignty of Ukraine and pushes back on Russian aggression. And I've seen some live comments that like don't understand this strategy and think it's not helping Ukraine, but it's Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky was at this summit meeting in Hiroshima. So I guess we'll see if it's successful and if it helps Ukraine and pushes back against Russia as this counteroffensive takes place in the next few weeks. But I was pointing out how like all of the news programs covered the press conference and the F-16s and what Biden said. There's one exception, and it's NBC News' Meet the Press. I don't know what was going on with Meet the Press this week, but I think it might have been recorded on Saturday. You'll see later I'm going to show a clip of Chuck Todd interviewing Janet Yellen, the Secretary of the Treasury, who is like in charge of deciding who gets paid if there's a default and how much money is left before there's a default. And that's an important clip. But he says, like, in the question I show, Chuck Todd says, you know, how much time is there until a default from today, May 20th? May 20th. But the program was broadcast on May 21st. And there's no indication in the entire program that they know about the Biden press conference a few hours before it aired, or the offer of the F-16s. None of that. It was the only news program that like seemed to have been recorded a day early. And the news summary also, it's like a pre-recorded idea about the increasing Republican presidential candidate field, and especially what's going on with Ron DeSantis and his like shadow campaign or pre-campaign, because he's supposed to announce, Senator Tim Scott of South Carolina announced today, and Ron DeSantis, the governor of Florida, is supposedly going to announce sometime in the next few days. And this may be that media bias I've talked about, where they have a bias for who their exclusive guest is. Here they have Byron Donalds, this Republican member of Congress from Florida, and so they talk a lot about Florida, although I don't know why Janet Yellen wasn't the like number one guest, given that the debt ceiling's the real important looming crisis. But anyway, I'll talk about all of that a little more after we watch the NBC News Meet the Press news summary that was like news one day delayed, maybe, over in this clip.
Good Sunday morning. This is going to be one of the busiest weeks yet in the presidential campaign as the 2024 Republican field grows. So do concerns among some Republicans that none of Donald Trump's current rivals are going to be able to beat him in a primary. South Carolina Senator Tim Scott is announcing his campaign tomorrow in his hometown of North Charleston before heading to the early states of Iowa and New Hampshire. And Florida Governor Ron DeSantis is expected to formally file paperwork for president this week. A bit of a soft launch of his campaign with a video and a donor retreat at the Four Seasons in Miami before formally having the big campaign rally announcement later in the month. But when the year began, DeSantis had the look and feel of not just a frontrunner, but of a potential juggernaut. The last 5 months have not been kind. Trump has relentlessly attacked him, and under those attacks, DeSantis has floundered a bit. He has struggled with big donors who have complained quite publicly that he, quote, doesn't even return phone calls. Others don't like his position on abortion, the 6-week ban, and believe it would be a problem in a general election. And still others worry about his charisma. He launched a book tour. It was immediately overshadowed when he called the Ukraine war a territorial dispute. He walked it back after some donors complained. Then there's the fight with Disney, where he took a political advantage and a victory, and it has now turned into a political problem. The DeSantis slump has made more Republicans who believe Donald Trump cannot win a general election flirt with jumping into this race themselves. From New Hampshire Governor Chris Sununu to North Dakota Governor Doug Burgum to former New Jersey Governor Chris Christie. And if no alternative materializes there, donors are likely to keep shopping for Republicans with general election appeal like Governor Brian Kemp or Governor Glenn Youngkin, who himself rolled out a curious video this week that cast himself as the successor to Ronald Reagan. In the meantime, it appears that the first big fight between the two current frontrunners for the Republican nomination will actually be over the issue of abortion and whose position makes them more electable. Ironically, that electability fight may not be about January 6th and Trump's growing legal baggage. This week, Trump said that, quote, many people within the pro-life movement feel DeSantis' 6-week abortion ban was too harsh. Well, DeSantis responded to Trump earlier this week.
As a Florida resident, he didn't give an answer about would you have signed the heartbeat bill that Florida did. They had all the exceptions that people talk about. The legislature put it in. I signed the bill. I was proud to do it. He won't answer whether he would sign it or not.
And joining me now is Republican Congressman Byron Donalds of Florida. Donalds, by the way, introduced
So, yeah, that was kind of weird. Wasn't that like kind of a pre-recorded news summary that it gave some good analysis of the problems of Ron DeSantis versus Donald Trump and Tim Scott announcing his campaign. And but why was it so different from all the other news summaries? Why? Am I wrong to assume that Chuck Todd didn't work on Sunday? It's like another example of if it's Sunday, it's Meet the Press. At least they broadcast on Sunday, but I don't think that they really recorded it or reported on anything that happened after Saturday, May 20th. That wasn't Meet the Press on Sunday, if you ask me. And I'll have a little more evidence of that with the Janet Yellen questioning coming up after the news summaries in clip 8. But I still have clip 6 and 7 to show you the much shorter news summaries from CNN and CBS. I like Jake Tapper and his very brief news summary here, which does cover the debt ceiling crisis, the Biden news conference, and even the F-16s that never seem to come up on Meet the Press in their much longer news summary and program. Well, same length program, but much longer news summary. And I'll talk about Jake Tapper's news summary a little more after we watch together over here.
Hello, I'm Jake Tapper in Washington, where the state of our union is careening toward the edge of an economic cliff with 11 days until the moment the U.S. government could run out of money to pay its bills, according to the Secretary of the Treasury. President Biden just told reporters he cannot guarantee that the U.S. will not default. That same message came from the top House Republican negotiator just hours before. It's the only thing the sides seem to agree on, in addition to blaming the other side for moving backwards in their talks. Biden says on his flight back to the U.S. this morning, he's going to tell House Speaker Kevin McCarthy in a phone call that the Republican Party needs to move off a negotiating position that Biden is calling extreme and unacceptable.
It's time for Republicans to accept that there is no bipartisan deal to be made solely on their partisan terms. They have to move as well.
The president said he does believe he has the authority to bypass Congress altogether by using the 14th Amendment, but he's not sure he has the time to do so given the legal challenges that would assuredly ensue. The growing self-inflicted crisis forced President Biden to cut short his foreign trip after meeting with key allies at the G7 in Japan. That's where world leaders came together to confront China's growing sway and to reaffirm their commitment to Ukraine. This included a face-to-face meeting with Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky and a reversal by Biden, who will now allow Ukrainians to be trained to use American-made F-16 fighter jets. And joining me now from Japan is the president's national security advisor, Jake Sullivan.
And I'm not really covering the Ukraine issue in depth, so I don't have a Jake Sullivan clip. What I will have is I will have 4 different Republicans being cross-examined. Well, first I'll have Chuck Todd trying to get Janet Yellen to say, what's the exact date the U.S. is going to run out of money? He doesn't do a great job getting that answer. And then I'll have CBS, ABC, CNN, and Fox News cross-examining 4 different Republicans about the debt ceiling deal. That's what's coming up after. And actually, I think maybe that CNN State of the Union news summary was the best one. It's either CNN or ABC, in my opinion. Because I mean, ABC was longer, but I think did the best job. CNN covered a lot of the same stuff shorter. I already explained why NBC screwed up by like recording a day early, as far as I can tell. Fox News Sunday had the bias I talked about. And now our final news summary, CBS News, Face the Nation, Margaret Brennan. It's just too brief, doesn't cover everything. I'll talk about it a little more after we watch it together over here.
Good morning and welcome to Face the Nation. Over the weekend, frustrations boiled over as talks broke down between the White House and Republicans who were trying to hammer out a deal to raise the federal government's borrowing limit before a looming June 1st deadline. President Biden said this morning he'll speak personally with House Speaker Kevin McCarthy on his flight home from the G7 summit in Japan in an effort to break the impasse. The window for action is narrowing. Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen predicts the country may only have enough cash to pay another week and a half worth of bills. And if the U.S. misses a payment, they'll have to make hard choices. A default would threaten the global economy. The last time negotiations were down to the wire like this was more than a decade ago. In 2011, then President Obama and Vice President Biden struck a deal with Senate Republicans just 2 days before a default. This time, the politics are far trickier. Joining us now are two congressmen trying to find some common ground, Pennsylvania Republican Brian Fitzpatrick and New Jersey Democrat Josh Gottheimer.
And I will show you Margaret Brennan's questioning of the Republican, Brian Fitzpatrick, in just a minute. That's one of the four Republicans I'm going to show you being cross-examined. The first one, not the best one. I think actually Jake Tapper does the best job of cross-examining a Republican on the debt ceiling crisis. But before I get to the four Republicans who get cross-examined, I want to show you the Treasury Secretary explaining when is it exactly that the United States is going to run out of money. June 1st, June 15th, June 14th. Chuck Todd doesn't really get us a great answer, and I don't know. You'll see some of the Republicans later claim that they don't even believe Janet Yellen when she says June 1st is the drop dead date, because she doesn't even really say that. It sounds like there might be another update coming. One of the things Janet Yellen says in here is that the Department of the Treasury it has a long history of updating the Congress on when we're going to run out of money, which makes me think that there might be another update coming. But here's Chuck Todd's cross-examination, such as it is on that issue. When will we run out of money? You let me know if you can understand the answer to that question after watching the cross-examination that I'll talk about with you a little more after we watch it together over here.
Welcome back. As the Treasury Department warns that the U.S. could breach the debt ceiling as soon as June 1st, this week negotiations were on, and then they were off, then they were on again, as the bases of both political parties balked at some of the compromises that were being made public that were supposedly on the table. A Republican aide told NBC News that House conservatives are, quote, privately seething at how the talks have been going, saying Republicans are giving away their leverage. Well, then you had 11 progressive Democrats in the Senate and 66 in the House are arguing that President Biden should invoke the 14th Amendment and pull out of talks completely, saying the Constitution requires the government to pay its debts. So, with the bases of both parties unhappy, in theory, we're in the sweet spot for a deal to get done. Or will the bases derail this deal? Joining me now is the Secretary of Treasury, Janet Yellen. Secretary Yellen, welcome back to Meet the Press.
Thanks so much, Chuck. It's a pleasure to be with you.
All right, I want to start with today's May 20th. 12 days is June 1st. How hard is 12 days? President Biden seemed to hint earlier this morning that he thought we're 2 to 3 weeks away. And, you know, 12 days, 2 weeks, we could argue there. But how hard is this June 1st deadline?
Well, I indicated in my last letter to Congress that we expect to be unable to pay all of our bills in early June and possibly as soon as June 1st. And I will continue to update Congress, but I certainly haven't changed my assessment. So I think that that's a hard deadline.
I want to point out something that a lot of House conservatives just simply don't believe what Treasury is doing. I'm going to read you one quote here. Some conservative Republicans have said for months that they felt Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen had exaggerated the risk of a default in June in a bid to put pressure on the House Republican majority. She's going to play it out now, saying it's a crisis. The day is here, said Rep. Ralph Norman, a member of the Freedom Caucus. What do you think you could do to convince Congressman Norman that that this early June deadline is real?
Well, Treasury has a long history of informing Congress about how much cash and headroom we have under the debt ceiling, and we take pride in the credibility of the forecasts that we make. I would point out that the Congressional Budget Office has recently indicated that they expect that early June is will be a problem, and forecasters on Wall Street who look at information daily on our cash balances and resources agree. So there will be hard choices to make if the debt ceiling isn't raised. And, you know, I would simply say since 1789, the United States has a history of paying its bills on time. That's what the world wants to see, a continued commitment to do that. It's what underlies U.S. Treasury securities as the safest investment on the planet. And it's not an acceptable situation for us to be unable to pay our bills.
I just want to sort of understand the go or no go to June 15th in this way. It's clear that June 1st is not hard, but it's the beginning of that period. What is the likelihood we can get to the June 15th tax receipts to avoid breaching the debt ceiling? Can you put a percentage on it? Is it 20%, 40%, something like that?
Well, there's always uncertainty about tax receipts and spending. And so it's hard to be absolutely certain about this, but my assessment is that the odds of reaching June 15th while being able to pay all of our bills is quite low.
Fair enough. Let me ask you about what are the sticking points here.
Yeah, fair enough. Is that after watching that whole clip, I'm still not sure exactly when the U.S. is going to run out of money. Like, she said that the Treasury Department takes pride in the accuracy of its predictions, but she didn't really give a specific prediction. Is it June 1st? Is it June 15th? Is it? I don't know. And that's going to come up in some of the cross-examinations of the Republicans I'm going to show you. Those are the last 4 clips, all newsmaker clips. I'm going to show first Margaret Brennan over on CBS News' Face the Nation, cross-examining Representative Brian Fitzpatrick, one of the more moderate Republicans, one of the co-chairs of the Problem Solvers Caucus in the House of Representatives, along with Josh Gottheimer. I won't show that clip, but I will show Margaret Brennan asking Representative Brian Fitzpatrick if they... Excuse me, I sneezed on camera. If they need some sort of short-term deal to negotiate how they're going to raise the debt ceiling before money runs out on June 1st, possibly, and I will talk about that clip a little more after we watch it together over here.
Start with you, Congressman Fitzpatrick. This was supposed to be the weekend when a deal was struck so you could vote in the coming days. Are we at the point where we need to talk about buying time with just a short-term lift of the debt ceiling so we avoid default.
Hi, Margaret. Thanks for having us. The president and the speaker are going to speak shortly, probably within the next hour or two, when the president is returning from Japan. I think it's really important that they sit down in person. It's really hard when you have emissaries acting on your behalf with the president not here to actually fix this. So we weren't incredibly surprised that they hit an impasse. This is going to take time. We knew it was going to take time, but you've heard both the speaker and the president still remain optimistic that they're going to figure this out. I do believe that they will, Margaret. We passed a bill in the House. Obviously, It's not something that the Senate's been willing to take up, but the Senate should take up something because they need to indicate to us what they can rally 60 senators around to get across the finish line, because the only way we get across the finish line, the president cannot take unilateral action here. The House and the Senate both have to pass their individual bills. We have to go to conference and send that conference report to the president.
Well, the president talked about that unilateral action, and even he said that would have legal consequences he's not confident in. But on the question of the short term, it sounds like you think there is still time for a broader deal on the budget and the debt ceiling.
I do, Margaret.
Okay.
The June 1st date was probably, according to Secretary Yellen, the earliest possible date. There's something called a non-technical default. That basically means a technical default would mean that we don't have enough cash flow to pay the interest on our debt. We do have enough cash flow to do that. We're going to start to see the state tax revenues come in about the second week of June. So I think we are okay on that. We will have time, and I really do think that we should allow leeway and flexibility for the speaker and the president, who both understand the gravity of this situation, to work this out. I think they will.
So, yeah, that was the most moderate of the Republicans who you're going to see interviewed, and he didn't really say anything controversial. You can decide whether you think that was a worthwhile cross-examination from Margaret Brennan about whether there should be a short-term delay in when or a short-term raising of the debt ceiling there. And her follow-up question was like, yes. So, and then, okay, were like the only follow-up questions there. So certainly not the cross-examination of the week, but it was more like a direct exam, getting like useful information out of the moderate Republican, but not really cross-examining him on, the House Republicans passed this plan that has huge cuts in discretionary spending because they like exclude any cuts to Social Security, Medicaid, Medicare, defense spending. So there's like huge cuts in other discretionary spending, like 22% cuts in like Pell Grants, Head Start, Section 8 housing, rental assistance, children lose access to food assistance, community health centers are cut so that like 2 million people lose it's the whole Republican plan is to not cut defense, not cut anything that Republicans care about, not raise taxes on the rich, and like cut services for the poor and the middle class, or the poor, working class, and middle class. And that wasn't really elucidated by Margaret Brennan, but the cross-examination of Jody Arrington, the chair of the House Budget Committee, was also not very good by Martha Raddatz over on ABC's This Week with George Stephanopoulos, and I will talk about that cross-examination a little more after we watch that clip together over here.
Heard what the president said, that the proposal you have put forward is unacceptable, citing tax breaks for big oil, cuts in health care. Your reaction?
Well, my reaction is the president's had almost 100 days without engaging the process now. His back is against the wall. We have one proposal that has passed the House. Nobody else has put a proposal on the table. So he needs to respond to that proposal, and now he's, I believe, just making more excuses not to negotiate a responsible debt ceiling deal that will raise the debt ceiling, pay our bills, protect the good faith and credit of the United States, but also deal with the spending problem that's driving the inflation crisis and some of the economic woes that we're experiencing, along with just this massive and unsustainable debt that we're carrying as a country. So I hope he changes his tune, and I hope in his conversation with Speaker McCarthy that it's more productive and more focused, again, on the one proposal that is passed, Republicans put forward and passed out of the House.
Well, the president said he's willing to cut spending by more than $1 trillion. He said that this morning, but he also wants Republicans to consider raising revenue. That has been a non-starter for Republicans, but will you reconsider?
No, because you couldn't get tax policies and tax revenues in the Senate bill. We certainly weren't going to put it in the House bill. So, number one, it's not on the table for discussion. Number two, taxes right now would only be passed on to consumers in higher prices. So we would exacerbate inflation. And our economy is growing now at just 1.1% GDP. That's down over the last 3 quarters. We're heading into recession. The last thing we want to do is add another tax. The president and Democrats passed out of the IRA, the Inflation Reduction Act, taxes on businesses, taxes on energy, taxes on investment. This is not the time to put a tax on our economy or on working families. The president, again, needs to deal with the proposal that passed the House. And our country is spending at wartime levels, Martha, almost 25% relative to GDP. We haven't spent that much since we invaded Normandy. I think the American people understand that the cost of living crisis that they're suffering with is as a result of spending, not because we have low taxes. The fact is we had record taxes going into COVID, and we had another record tax revenue year in 2021.
The White House sources familiar with the negotiations are telling our Rachel Scott the latest proposal would keep non-defense and defense discretionary spending flat from 2023 to 2024, and the Republicans want to increase defense spending. That's despite $45 billion more than President Biden had proposed last time.
Well, let's give some context to the discretionary budget. Our federal government is 40% bigger today than it was going into COVID. Secondly, the president was the lead negotiator in 2011 for a 10-year spending cap deal, and he was doing that in the context of a debt ceiling negotiation. So this isn't unprecedented. Even the president's own budget, if you look at his 10-year budget resolution proposal that he introduced about a month ago, he has $2.7 trillion in discretionary cuts. If you annualize that, that's over $200 billion a year. We're talking about going back to $130 billion. That's what we were spending as a nation discretionary just 6 months ago. So this is more than reasonable, but we have to get back to pre-COVID, pre-inflationary spending. We've got to right size and rein in this bureaucratic bloat that we've pulled out of COVID, and we've got to deal with that legacy and efficiency.
Congressman, the president said he can't guarantee that Republicans won't force a default.
And then the rest of the questioning was about, like, who's responsible if there's a default, and not a lot of cross-examination on some of the things that Jody Arrington, the Republican chair of the Budget Committee, said. At the end there, he was talking about how, we have to go back to pre-COVID, pre-inflationary spending. Well, if everything costs more because of inflation for, a while there, inflation was like 9%, 6% a year. So, that means everything costs more. So if you cut government spending by, if you only increase government spending by 1%, but everything costs 6 or 9% more, that's a huge cut. And that's some of the cuts I was talking about before. And I mean, that's the thing about what causes inflation. It's like too much money in the economy. And there are two ways. Well, there are more than two ways. But there are two ways that the Congress can take money out of the economy. The other way is the Fed increasing interest rates so that money's more expensive. That takes money out of the economy as well, or not printing as much money. That's a whole different thing. But what that's the Fed. But what the Congress can do to take money out of the economy, there are two ways. They can decrease the spending of the government or increase taxes. Increasing taxes takes money out of the economy, which decreases inflation. The less money that's chasing goods, that's what causes inflation, right? Too much money chasing too few goods. Well, raising taxes takes some of that money out of the economy. And one of the causes of inflation is the Trump tax cut that put a bunch of money into the economy and never paid for it. That never gets brought up in most of these discussions. But the thing about increasing taxes, Jody Arrington in that discussion with Martha Raddatz claimed, oh, well, we can't put any increase in taxes in our package because that won't pass the Senate. Martha Raddatz never asked him, well, what you passed in the House won't pass the Senate either, even though later in his answer he even pointed out how the Senate won't pass what the House passed. But that was like his only explanation for why they are saying they won't consider any tax increases because it won't pass the Senate. Well, their spending cuts also won't pass the Senate, so that was kind of bogus. And I talked about how tax increases increase inflation because those costs get passed on to the consumer, he said. Well, if you look at monetary theory, you understand that it's not the deficit that causes inflation. It's too much money chasing too few goods, and the government can fix that either by decreasing spending or increasing taxes, and that never came up. And he made multiple statements about, the cost of living is increased by spending, not taxes. That was something else Jody Arrington got away with saying with no cross-examination. So I didn't think that was a great cross-examination by Martha Raddatz. The best cross-examination of the week, I think, is Jake Tapper talking to Bill Cassidy, both asking him about whether Republicans need to move now that Biden has agreed to some spending caps. Now, do they have to move for, revenue increases or whatever? And then he also talks about how this crisis may be coming in reality because there are so many irrational Republicans, and they're irrational in multiple ways, and Jake Tapper brings that up. So this is probably the cross-examination of the week that I will talk about with you a little more after we watch it together over here.
Welcome back to State of the Union. I'm Jake Tapper. The chances of a U.S. debt default appear to be growing, according to both Democrats and Republicans, as negotiators split over stubborn issues, and lawmakers on both sides worry if there is a deal, they won't like what their leaders gave up to get it. Meanwhile, my next guest says any deal would ignore a costly, growing problem. Joining us now to discuss, Republican Senator Bill Cassidy. of Louisiana. Senator, thanks for joining us. So a potential default could now just be 11 days away, theoretically. President Biden said today that he's done his part. Now it's time for Republicans to move. How worried are you that a catastrophic default could actually happen? And do you think Republicans who are negotiating need to be willing to move more?
Well, a couple things. First, I think the president needs to show leadership. He took about 100 days to gauge, to kick in, and now that he's finally negotiating, I'm pleased that he's doing so. But I also want to point out that Secretary Yellen's comment about when default occurs, potentially as early as the 1st of June, but it could be later. Well, let's have a little leadership. The financial markets are all nervous about this. Is it the 1st or is it the 14th? A quarterly payment of taxes comes to the federal government beginning on the 15th, at which point the risk of default is averted. So the president just needs to step up and calm down the markets by being specific. And lastly, the president has been jacking up spending his first 2 years of the presidency. Now he wants Republicans to accept that as a new baseline. I think Republicans and the American people are reasonable to say, Mr. President, just because you have artificially inflated spending for the first 2 years of your presidency, by the way, giving us all kinds of inflation to boot, does that become the new baseline? We don't think it necessarily has to. And I think Republicans are reasonable to ask that it be reset back down. Yeah,
You're referring to the fact that the White House, according to reports, offered to, as part of this negotiation, offered to freeze spending, I think, at 2022 levels, whereas obviously McCarthy and the Republicans negotiating wanted it to be frozen at earlier levels. The House Freedom Caucus, a group of very conservative Republicans in the House Republican Caucus, they're saying that they're going to oppose basically any compromises to the original legislation that they passed. A majority of the House Republican Party, we should note, voted to not count electoral votes from Arizona and Pennsylvania based on election lies that you stood up against. Do you think the House Republican Caucus can be counted on to arrive at a reasonable compromise in these debt negotiations, given that fact, that ugly fact that sometimes they take pretty extreme positions?
Well, I think that I have strong feelings about the last election and how that transpired, but nonetheless, I think that's a totally separate issue. And let's give a tip of the hat to Kevin McCarthy. The package that he sent to the president, he had Republicans voting for a debt ceiling increase who had never previously voted for a debt ceiling increase. And I don't think we can allow existential anxiety about the future to kind of dictate what is done today. Once Kevin said in a private meeting, never ask me to do something because you think I can't. Let me first go out there and see if I can. I think the president needs to step forward, make an earnest effort to meet Republicans and the American people on the issue of lowering our indebtedness. And if they do so, let's see what McCarthy can do. And I'd like to have more faith in Kevin.
President Biden also said this morning that he thinks that he has the authority to lift the debt limit on his own using the 14th Amendment.
Oh, yeah, the whole 14th Amendment issue. And if you want to see the whole interviews, where I've only taken clips, by the way, down in the video description, first I put media mention, where I give you short summaries of all the clips that I'm showing, all 12. They're short summaries of the 12 clips under media mention. Then under sources, I give you links to the source of all the clips I'm showing you. And if you want to see talk about the 14th Amendment, I kind of talked about that last week. I'm not talking about I don't think that Biden is going to use the 14th Amendment's full faith and credit, the debt of the United States shall not be questioned or whatever, and one of the clauses of the 14th Amendment. Biden in his press conference Sunday morning says he thinks he does have that authority, but he doesn't think he has the time to litigate it before we default, so he's not going to do it. So it's kind of a moot question anyway, so I'm not showing that. Otherwise, I thought that was a pretty good cross-examination where Jake Tapper talked about the different spending levels, why should we go back to a couple years ago, and Bill Cassidy gave his kind of bogus answer, and then Jake Tapper talked about the lack of rationality of a huge amount of the Republican caucus, which is why I was talking at the beginning of this live stream that, just because it's never happened before doesn't mean it's not going to happen now, because there are a lot more crazy Republicans who won't agree, and basically Kevin McCarthy can't even make a deal unless that deal also involves a whole bunch of Democrats in the House voting for whatever the compromise is, because he cannot pass a deal, any deal that raises the debt ceiling without some of the ridiculous things I talked about before. It only passed by one vote, and that included like George Santos. That's why they can't kick out George Santos, because Kevin McCarthy needed his vote to get their like totally bogus plan that would cut so many important programs for the poor, the middle class, the working class. That's not going to happen, and hopefully this will get resolved, but I don't really have a lot of confidence that it will, because the Republicans are so irrational at this point. And speaking of irrational Republicans, I have one more clip to show you. I told you this would be a brief clip of Ted Cruz. I apologize in advance for subjecting you to even 1 minute and 57 seconds of Ted Cruz, but this is like the one point in this totally subservient pro-Republican propaganda interview from Shannon Bream of Ted Cruz. Like the one time she like actually asked a somewhat confrontational question was like, hey, by the way, you Republicans, you like racked up a lot of debt in the Trump years and voted to raise the debt ceiling. Why should you be so tough on the deficit now? But first of all, she didn't really, in like a quarter of all the debt occurred during the Trump administration, with the Republicans raising the debt ceiling 3 times, and she didn't really ask the question as hard as she could. And then she let Ted Cruz get away with basically the rest of the clip is total BS, Republican talking points, and I keep running it till you can see she's not really going to follow up. I think she asks about the 14th Amendment. I can't remember, but at the end of this clip, there's no follow-up, and there's a whole bunch of bogus talking points from Ted Cruz, which I may point out at the end of the final Newsmaker clip we can watch together over here.
Okay, but fair to say, Republicans have added to what we have now in the debt. I mean, they voted for a lot of these things.
Yes.
You voted multiple times to raise the debt ceiling under President Trump. So why is this different?
Well, it's different because the magnitude of where the debt is massive. And what has happened in the last 2 years, you are right, during Donald Trump's presidency, during COVID, Republicans and Democrats in a bipartisan way passed emergency COVID relief that was very expensive. We were facing a pandemic. We had politicians who had shut much of the country down. And in that emergency, we acted. What happened subsequently is that you had Joe Biden and Chuck Schumer and Nancy Pelosi do a complete takeover of the federal government, and they went on a spending binge. And all of that was predominantly hard partisan spending, trillions and trillions of dollars of hard Democrat objectives, things like 87,000 new IRS agents. I've yet to find someone in Texas who wants 87,000 new IRS agents. They understand those agents are being brought in to harass and target the political enemies of the administration. That's not an economic objective. That's a political objective.
Well, we're being told that they are being brought in to bring more revenue, which we know we hit a record level in fiscal 22 for government revenue that was brought in. So talking about where that money goes is another part of the conversation. I want to quickly.
But the more revenue. Sure. The more revenue is going to be from the people they target, which sadly under this administration has proven to be their political enemies.
Okay. And it does tend to be lower income people. It's not always the billionaires out there who are getting those audits. Quickly before you go, I want to ask you about, you've written to Anheuser-Busch to ask them to investigate a deal that Bud Light had with influencer Dylan Mulvaney and whether that amounted to wrongfully targeting alcohol advertising at young people. There's been some pushback, as you would imagine. And there's been
some pushback. pushback, as you would imagine, because, of course, so much of alcohol advertising it bleeds over into targeting minors. I mean, that's kind of a joke. But the cross-examination from Shannon Bream there was a joke. I mean, she did start off talking about the how Republicans did rack up some debt, but she didn't really frame it in the most confrontational way about how Trump and the Republicans racked up more debt during the Trump administration. It's basically about a quarter of the total debt, and it's not really. Basically, Republicans only care about the debt and deficits when there are Democratic presidents, and that has been going on for so long and was most egregious during the Trump administration that I can't even believe they're like turning around and claiming to care about the deficit at this point. But the most ridiculous part of that cross-exam or non-cross-examination from Shannon Bream was the whole thing about the 80,000 or 86,000 new IRS agents, which is like an explicit part of the House Republicans' plan was to repeal that, which actually loses the government hundreds of billions of dollars. Ted Cruz kept saying they're spending $30 billion on these new IRS agents, which are explicitly there to make sure that billionaires know, the billionaires have so many more accountants and lawyers, and they so outgun the IRS. That's why it is that it's more low-income people, not billionaires, who get audited, which Shannon Bream, that was her follow-up. But the real follow-up is, well, the reason billionaires don't get audited is because we need these extra IRS agents who have the expertise to actually audit the billionaires. And the CBO, the Congressional Budget Office, actually says that spending this $30 billion on extra IRS agents to go after the billionaires will bring in hundreds of billions of dollars over the 10-year period. So that was really bad cross-examination from Shannon Bream. And of course, Ted Cruz kept saying, well, we know this money's going to be used to attack Biden's political enemies, and never asked for any evidence of that totally baseless charge that Ted Cruz just pulled out of his, well, you decide where Ted Cruz pulled that charge from, but that was the last of the newsmaker clips. My last clip I'm going to show you. I hope you all appreciate the 8 to 10 hours it took me to put together this live stream, which I have been doing every Monday for, I think next week, well, this was Monday Media Mix-Up number 103, so at 104, that's like 52 weeks a year times 2, so like it's my 2-year anniversary next week, maybe. That's also going to be Memorial Day, and I actually have tickets to see this musical show later in the evening, so next Monday I'll probably do the show a little bit on the earlier side. I know I always delay, but actually it'll probably be more like 3 or 4 p.m. Pacific time next week. I don't know if I'll have some reason to put out some other video during the week. I might have some time this week, I'm not sure, but whether or not I do, I will be back next Monday and every Monday all the way through the 2024 election cycle, which goes all the way to January 2025 at least. And that's my commitment to my viewers, whether there be many of you or few of you, depending on the week. Last week, my video got like over 1,000 views. It like hit some weird algorithmic search engine thing. I don't know why more people watched it last week than usual, but anyway, I appreciate any of you who are watching. Let me know if you like what I'm doing, and I will be back next Monday and every Monday for the time period I've already indicated. And until then, I guess I will be seeing all of you around the internet.